Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. Today we're looking at 1 Corinthians 9 to 11. In the grand scheme of 1 Corinthians, it seems like there's a little bit less packed into these couple chapters, but there are some things worth pointing out and bringing attention to. The first one is chapter 9. Basically spends a lot of time, Paul kind of defending himself, pointing out the fact that he has never taken advantage of the Corinthian church. He did not come into the Corinthian church to try to take their money or get rich off of what he was doing. He does make the case that it would not be wrong for him to make a living by preaching the gospel. In fact, he says that he would be entitled to compensation. He's allowed to make a living from just preaching the gospel. But Paul pretty universally tries to not do that. I think we read earlier in Thessalonians, I believe, that he was not taking advantage of the people. He was not trying to make money off of them. Here in Corinthians, apparently, he was also not trying to make money off of them. There are times where Paul is making a living from preaching the gospel, but not in Corinthians. And it's obvious that he doesn't want to ever be accused of trying to lead people to believe something so that they will financially support him. And I think, honestly, Paul gives us a pretty good example. It's kind of a balanced perspective where he's saying, hey, it's not wrong for a pastor to be paid to deliver the gospel and shepherd his people, but it is a dangerous thing. It can be a tricky thing where a pastor becomes overwhelmed by the love of money. Actually, we'll see that Paul teaches Timothy that nobody who loves money is fit to be an elder or overseer in the church. That's coming in 1 Timothy. And then he also says in 2 Timothy that a sign of the end of the age will be that people will turn to loving money. So Paul's very aware of money and the allure that it has, the idolatry that it carries with it. And here he's teaching in a kind of a cautious manner that money can kind of distort our view of what it means to preach and teach the gospel. It can lead people away from teaching the true gospel. And I think in our culture today, it's easy for pastors to fall into shying away from preaching the gospel, shying away from teaching hard truths. Because when you start to teach hard truths, people start to leave your church. And so I think Paul is wise in saying that he wasn't asking for money when he was preaching in Corinth. It also makes sense that, you know, he's writing these very direct letters. It was just in chapter 5 that he was calling out open sin in the Corinthian church. It might have been a little bit more difficult for him to do that if he was being paid full time to be a pastor in this church. So there is some real-world application to this. It's not wrong to pay your pastor. Your pastor works very hard, keeps a pretty full schedule, I'm sure, and is kind of on call 24/7. So there's nothing wrong with a pastor being paid to share the gospel. But it is something to be careful about because it is very easy to fall into loving only money, and it is very easy to twist the gospel because you love money. And I think people that are falling into that, they might not even be twisting the gospel. They might just not be preaching certain things. I think it's a pretty common critique where certain churches refuse to touch on certain topics, where certain celebrity pastors refuse to say where they stand on certain contentious issues. And I think, you know, at the very root of that, it comes back to a money issue. They're afraid that they would lose income or their church would lose income because of taking a stance. So Paul's saying here, like, hey, you can believe me because I'm not trying to take money from you. I'm just trying to bless you with the gospel. Then he moves into this teaching on idolatry, kind of this teaching on the freedom that we have in Christ. A very clear problem in the Corinthian culture and other cultures as well would have been that a lot of the meat in the meat markets had been sacrificed to idols. So when new Christians were coming to Christ, they had this problem where they couldn't actually discern what foods had been sacrificed to idols and which hadn't, because it was so common. And so Paul tells them, hey, you have freedom. We have life in Christ. You can eat things that have been sacrificed to idols unless you're going to visit somebody and they tell you, hey, we just sacrificed this out back. You're free to eat it. Then you have to reject it. So the idea here is that when we are aware that idolatry has taken place, we want to be a witness with the decisions that we make. And I think we're not really dealing with that kind of stuff in this day and age. But there are times, I think, when we might become aware of sin that otherwise we might not have been aware of. You might become aware of something that is an affront to God. And I think you could use this 1 Corinthians chapter 10 passage to make the case that when you become aware of something that is sinful, you can call that out, and you should call that out. If you don't know about it, you can't say anything about it. But if you do become aware of something, it is actually respectful and honoring of God to do so. It's a little bit of a stretch to pull that out of 1 Corinthians 10, but I don't think it's too big of a stretch. So Paul closes out 1 Corinthians 10 with this passage. This is verse 31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all for the glory of God. This is a really powerful passage because he's reminding the Corinthian church, and he's done this before in several chapters, just reminding them that no matter what you do, make sure everything you do is reflecting the power of Christ, the authority of Christ, and that you are a witness to the world. It reminds me a lot of the passage in Colossians that says when you work, you should work for the Lord, as to the Lord, and not for men. Like the things that we do are important. Even like the tiny little things that we do here, Paul's saying what you eat and what you drink, make sure you honor God with how you do that. It's a good encouragement for us today to do exactly that. Now, 1 Corinthians 11 is really interesting. Me growing up in a Mennonite church and a Mennonite culture, this is the head covering passage, so it might matter more to me than it does to you if you didn't grow up in that culture and context. But Paul's basically teaching in this Corinthian church that there is an order to how worship should happen. He's going to spend the first half of the chapter talking about how men and women should conduct themselves in church. Then he's going to spend the last half of the chapter talking about how the Lord's Supper should be conducted. So really, the entire chapter is about conduct in the churches, order in the churches, and Paul is actually going to elaborate on this as we continue into 1 Corinthians, further into 1 Corinthians in the next couple of days, what it looks like to have order in your church. When it comes to head coverings, I guess maybe this is just a selfish perspective, but coming from a Mennonite background, Paul's telling women that their heads should be covered, and it's funny to me that I heard that passage several times, but I never heard the just a couple verses later. If a woman has long hair, this is verse 15, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. So basically what Paul is saying, and some of this is cultural for this Corinthian context, women, when they come to churches, should be respectful of their husbands and mindful of their husbands. And a wife and a husband should mutually submit to each other as they submit to God. And he's suggesting that a woman should have her head covered. But then he also says that her hair is provided to her for a covering. So growing up Mennonite, I didn't necessarily do this. We didn't do this in our family, but many families around us, like women wore head coverings, sometimes all the time, sometimes just in church. But the passage actually says that your hair is a covering for your head. So I don't know that that's necessary to do. And I think there's undoubtedly a cultural piece here present where Paul is recommending to the Corinthian church that there should be this covering in place. And again, I think he says like there is a covering necessary, but hair is provided for a covering. And you do have to recognize that he does say there is no such practice here, nor do the churches of God practice these things. So there's a clear call to submission. There's going to be more of that, but Paul usually calls out wives submitting to their husbands, but also mutually submitting to each other out of care and concern for each other. Later on, Paul's going to write in Ephesians that husbands have to love their wives as Christ loved the church. So husbands actually have the harder command, and we'll talk about that when we get to Ephesians. Now, the Lord's Supper passage is interesting too, because apparently the Corinthians, when they were coming together for the Lord's Supper, they were just throwing like giant raucous parties. People were actually getting drunk when it came time to celebrate the Lord's table, and then other people were going hungry. So you had extreme opposites taking place, and most likely this is coming out of the divisions that were present in the church. So Paul tells them that, hey, when you celebrate the Lord's table, when you do the Lord's Supper, today we've kind of watered it down a little bit. We call it communion. What they would have been doing would have been a little bit bigger deal than just passing tiny little cups and tiny little wafers around. These concepts still hold true for us. Paul's basically teaching that, hey, this is an important thing. This is a solemn thing. There should be no division among you when you remember Christ's sacrifice for you, and the things that you do should be honoring to him. So he encourages us to examine our lives, examine our motivations, our thoughts, just examine who we are when we do this in remembrance of Jesus. And Paul tells the Corinthian church that because they've been doing this in an unworthy manner, the Lord is judging them, and many of them are sick, and many of them have died. He also says that when you do this in an unworthy manner, you drink a cup of cursing upon yourself. So this is no joke. And I think it should remind us even today to take communion very seriously. This is not something that you do just to fill time in a service. This is not something you do just to, fill the thing you have to do every quarter or every month or whatever. This is a really important thing that we do to commemorate the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. And we want to make sure that we are doing it in the right spirit and from the right heart. And I think when we water this down, we put ourselves in a dangerous place. I think when we encourage people to do this who do not understand what they're doing, we put ourselves in a dangerous place, and we need to exercise some caution here. It's fantastic. It's a powerful thing to commemorate the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus through communion. But we do need to be mindful of the fact that Paul actually taught the Corinthian church that when you do this in an unworthy manner, you curse yourselves, and you end up with sickness and death because of it. So we do need to take this seriously. So I think your part for today, you can probably round up a couple if you want to, but the most powerful one for me is the thing that Paul says at the end of chapter 10, whatever you eat or drink, do so for the glory of God. I just want to encourage you, whatever you are doing today, maybe you're headed into work, maybe you're headed home, whatever you're doing, do it for the honor and glory of God. And I just encourage you to take a couple of minutes today before you walk into your house, before you walk into your office, before you walk onto the job site, and literally think, okay, what would it look like for me to honor God with what I'm about to do today? And then make sure you actually act on that. So I hope you're encouraged by that. I am enjoying our time in 1 Corinthians. Tomorrow we'll be back going through 1 Corinthians 12 to 14. We'll see you then. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.